Okay, this is a test video for me. I haven't tried a YouTube video in a long time and don't have anything else up at the moment. But I decided to put one up with all of the interest that's out there in the man Jordan Peterson. And I see it as a real opportunity as a pastor of a church to reach out to people who are being influenced by Jordan Peterson and are maybe wanting to explore beyond the things that he's saying. And I'll just be honest, I see this as a great opportunity as a pastor to be involved in outreach, to reach out to people and let them know a little bit more about the church and about avenues for exploring further some of the things that they're studying with Jordan Peterson. My own story of him is that I didn't come to know about him through the controversies. In fact, I've never really watched from start to finish any of the videos related to the bill that he was protesting in Canada. That really wasn't my interest. One day I was getting ready for the day and I was looking for something to watch on phenomenology. And he had a video on the phenomenology of being. And I didn't know anything about the guy. I just started watching this video on the phenomenology of being, and I saw this is a guy who has thoroughly mastered his subject. He has read the material, he's digested it, he's fully understood it, he's made it his own. And if you ever notice, he'll talk about the people that he reads and respects. They're usually people who've done that very thing. And you can tell that that's something he values and that he has really done. And he often talks to young people about becoming articulate, really mastering a subject, becoming competent, and the power in that. And again, I think it's obvious to me that he's speaking from experience. That here's a guy who truly has spent some time not just researching and studying these things, but thinking about them, pondering them, working them through what he has come to know, and has made it his own, and has his own insights to share, his own new material that he's developing based on all of his studies. And so I think that's the source of his appeal, is that you get this feeling you're really dealing with someone who, in this area, he knows what he's talking about. He knows what he knows really well, and especially in the area of psychology and the science of the brain and other things like that. It's just obvious that here's a guy who really knows what he's talking about. And I think the other thing that is a real appeal of him is he emphasizes that to always speak the truth. And you get the feeling that he's only speaking of things he really truly believes, and that he is seeking to speak truth. And so you don't feel like he's I don't know, struggling to share the things that he's sharing. These are things that he really believes in, and he's not making things up. He wouldn't speak of them, you get the feeling, unless he really felt like he knows what he knows, and he's only shares what he knows, and he's open to growth and learning. And so all these things are very powerful, very potent. It's amazing to me how you can listen to hours of the things that he's saying, and it's endlessly fascinating. And a lot of people have felt that way, and has opened them up to ways of thinking that they never thought of before. Um, we live in a time when people have been stuck in certain ways of thinking and disconnected from others that are actually more ancient and have a lot to offer us in the modern world. I'm thinking specifically of the method of really examining something so that you get down to the very core of it, the very heart of it, the very truth of it. This is something Jordan Peterson does. It goes all the way back, of course, to Socrates and the Socratic method, or the dialectic that it was called, he called it, where you keep looking at a subject from the various sides. And he would do this in the dialogues of Plato. He's doing this where he's looking at something from the various sides and saying, no, it's not that, it's not this, until finally he drills down through this dialectic method and gets to the truth. And of course, for Socrates and then Plato after him, there really is such a thing as an objective truth or reality out there that a person can drill down to through this method. And Plato had the word idea. It doesn't mean what it means for us today to say ideas, so people later on started using a word that later Aristotle was the one who really came up with the word form, and they talk about Plato's form. But the idea is that Plato saw that there was an objective reality to the world, to being itself, as Jordan Peterson will say, following some of the later philosophers, especially I think of Martin Heidegger and those who would talk in those terms of being. But he's following a very similar method. And in the early 20th century, there was a guy, Edmund Husserl, and he was really the father of phenomenology. And phenomenology is a kind of a return to this belief that there's an objective reality that we can drill down to. And the method of phenomenology, and you see this in Martin Heidegger, where he would even just take a word and he would look at its etymology, and working through its etymology, try to drill down to the very meaning of the word. And usually when you drill down to the very meaning of the word, you get to the truth that that word was pointing to. And the phenomenological method is to examine something like love or justice or power, and you drill down in the examination of that from all sides using this phenomenological method, and you let the method point people to the fact that you've struck onto the truth, you've hit gold, so to speak. And I think of that with Jordan Peterson with his 12 rules, is that these are things that he's basically in his own life drilled down to and said, these are foundational things that I believe are absolutely true that you can build your life on. And of course, he's gone about it his way, looking at it through meaning and that the sense of meaningfulness, as in his lectures on the maps of meaning, his book on the maps of meaning, that he believes he's really struck on a bedrock reality that a person can begin to then build their life on. And that, I think, is what is attracting people. But this is a fascinating thing, because he's saying that there's actually something called objective truth that he believes is real. I watched the discussion that he had there in Canada with William Lane Craig, and I can't remember the female philosopher who was there, and it was then Jordan Peterson, and it was a discussion on what is the meaning of life, or something like that. But I remember what I take away from that especially is, in that discussion, Jordan Peterson was saying that when it came to Friedrich Nietzsche, Nietzsche thought with the death of God and his conception that we would have to create our own values. And Peterson said that he didn't believe that. He believed that we would need to discover values. Well, you see, that's exactly what the Socratic method was all about. The dialectic was to discover through an analysis of being, you might say. Is that what they were doing? I mean, Plato was seeking true being, the true forms, to discover values. And so people who are aware of the history of philosophy, and I'm no expert in this area. I've just studied it several different times in my preparations to be a pastor. No, though, but people who've studied this know this goes all the way back to the very foundations of Western philosophy, this idea that values are not something we concoct or make, but they're actually things we discover. And they're discoverable through these various methods of dialectic, Socratic method, phenomenological analysis, because people have found that they've discovered them that way. They've been able to show in ways that are convincing that they've hit something, and I think that's what's happening with Peterson. They've hit something rock solid, something real, something that's there. And people have believed that for a long time. And then he has also hit onto something that with the rise of postmodernism, you have had this, um, you know, questioning whether or not there is such a thing as universal truth, as objective values, as those things that are discoverable and knowable by all people that we can all look at. And what's interesting about that is one of the arguments that Peterson uses to say there is such a thing as an objective truth is he says, yes, there's umpteen, infinite number of ways you can approach something, but only very few of them actually work. I don't know if you've watched any of his videos, you recognize that that argument. He uses that a lot. Well, again, that's in one of the dialogues of Plato, the Theaetetus, I think is how you say it. It's responding to the theories of Protagoras, who was in his own way kind of a relativist. You know, it's all relative to the person. And in that dialogue, the same idea is put forward there that in time, every way of looking at things proves itself by how it the results over time, you might say. And so there's nothing new under the sun. And so many people have brought this up in various web articles, blog posts, that that Peterson's really not saying anything new, except I would say what I think is the new part about it is that he's not approaching it solely from that philosophical angle of the analysis of being, the analysis of reality, that drilling down to those bedrock things alone. He's also taking the tool of the materialist, you might say, the person who doesn't believe there's anything beyond, or the empiricist, you might say, the person who doubts that there's anything deeper than the empirical world around us. And he uses their I don't know, I guess he's using the thing that they oftentimes will use to say there are no objective values, and that is evolution. And he's saying, actually, no, what is evolution all about? Evolution is all about being fitted to reality. And these human concepts that human beings have deep within them. And he definitely does not believe that human beings in the Lockean tradition, you know, would say, you know, that you're a tabula rasa, you're a blank slate. He doesn't believe that. He believes, I guess it was more Kant, if I'm remembering my philosophy well, who believed that we came into this world with various categories and things within our thinking and within our human nature. And Peterson makes a strong case through his use of science to say that we do have these categories. We do have these instincts, these archetypes that Carl Jung would speak of. And these things within us, they're not, in a sense, arbitrary, you know, just they're, and then therefore religion is not arbitrary, the great religious symbols, because they represent human fittedness to reality and to navigating reality successfully. And so they've proven themselves over the long spans of time that it took for them to be formed within the person to be that which, like Plato was saying in the Theaetetus, that which over time proved themselves to be in touch with the rock bottom, bedrock solid truth, and that there is a truth, and that as human beings we should avail ourselves of this knowledge of truth that we have within us that you can't get in other ways, that religious symbols like those that he discusses, the ones that Carl Jung analyzed and develops and finds across the spectrum of human culture and the times, in human history, that these things are universally there. That we should avail ourselves of the knowledge and of the wisdom of the past and of tradition. That, as he says, it represents explored territory. It represents that which is being passed on to us, albeit as it gets codified in culture and tradition. It needs to be recaptured every generation, as he says, and made its own, and in some ways modified and adjusted as we gain new knowledge. So all of this is just very fascinating because it fits so well with a person who, like myself, is a pastor who believes in objective truth and who actually believes that the form of all forms, to speak in a Platonic sense, the ultimate good is God, and all other truth, all other forms, all other categories of being, share in that ultimate that is God. And so many of the things that Peterson is doing leads up to that. He gets right up to what you'll say, the metaphysical. And another term for metaphysical would be the ontological, that which has to do with the nature of being. What is the nature of being? And what is the nature of being itself, that which is the source and ground of all being? The traditional Christian answer is the ground and source of all being, the ultimate good and truth and beauty, is the reality that we call God, and that this ultimate truth and beauty and being is being revealed. You might say that a part of what, from a Christian standpoint, Jordan Peterson is doing is he's explicating the Christian notion of general revelation. It's especially, I think, a Protestant term, general revelation. The idea that God is known in nature, in ourselves, and in the course of history, and that there is a knowledge of God out there. Paul will talk in the book of Acts to the people at Mars Hill and say that in the past, God was making himself known, that by groping they might find him. And that language of a groping and looking after to find God, that just seems to be almost what Jordan Peterson is describing, is the limits. He's come up to the limits. He gets right up to the limits of what can be known in this general revelation kind of way, which includes the knowledge of how to live a good life, because if God is the source of being itself, is being itself in the sense of the source of being, then all being participates in his nature in the sense that it reflects his nature, and the good, the true, and the beautiful flow out of his nature, and it's as we live in tune with that nature that we experience the right life, what Peterson would call the meaningful life, by being in tune with that which is the source of all being. So he comes right up onto that. Now, of course, Christians believe that beyond general revelation, there is also special revelation, that God was being especially made known. In the history of the people of Israel, their story, as told in what we Christians call the Old Testament, and that their experience and what the prophets were doing there, and the writers, compilers, and editors of the Old Testament were doing there, was something that went beyond merely the kind of general revelation that Peterson talks about. That's something that where I might disagree with Jordan Peterson on, and that is in his analysis of the Old Testament, he shows all the ways in which those ingrained stories and categories and structures and ways of being are in all of those stories that you can find everywhere, those universal archetypes. And they are there in the Old Testament. I would expect them to be there as a Christian, and that they would participate in the universal structure of reality and would share a lot in common with the various religions around the world. But that I totally and completely expect that. However, beyond that, uh, Christians say that when you examine these stories, for example, when you examine the creation story, you notice that there's some things that are, while they're similar to the other creation stories, they're different. They point to a deeper participation in reality than you find just generally available. That, in the words of the New Testament, there's a being inspired. To be inspired is to be lifted up beyond your basic knowledge into a deeper reality, a deeper understanding of that reality. And so one of the things, time and again, when I've studied the book of Genesis and I've consulted the works of Old Testament scholars, people who know that much better than I do, they point out that when you compare the creation story of the Hebrews to the other stories of that ancient Near East, you find there's a big difference. Among the other peoples of that time, the gods made human beings as an afterthought, and as an afterthought for the purpose of serving them, the gods. And there's a real lording it over the human being. And so what's so striking and different, and what I think is one of those things pointing to the inspiration of the Hebrew Bible, is the pinnacle of the creation. That which the creation is moving towards is the creature who is made in the image of God. I do agree with, I think, with Jordan Peterson when he says, one of the characteristics of God is that God can speak the word, and in speaking that word bring the truth and order to chaos. And you do have that imagery there of the water and the deep, and God speaking order and creating space for the humans. And I do think that that's a key element to what it means to be made in the image of God, is that we are these verbal creatures that through the word, and I think that's a part of when we speak of human beings as spirit, in the sense of being able to rise above our mere nature and conditioning. What is it that allows us to rise above that, to transcend our natural humanity and our biology, our genetics, our even our environment? It's new information, new words, and through the power of that word, through the power of the new information, you just think about what happens with Jordan Peterson. Is people all over are saying, he's changed my life. I was going one direction, and the outcome of my life was going to be this hell, is what I saw my life going to. And he's very good at talking about how these things like heaven and hell and all that, they're not arbitrary categories. They represent, real life. And I think he does a great job just decimating the arguments of these people nowadays who, want to cut off humanity from all of its heritage, and say that's all junk and it was all fantasy and it was all wishful thinking. I mean, it's a very, the more you think about that viewpoint, you just see how, and Jordan Peterson does a great job of doing this, of showing how that's just silly. That doesn't explain these things, why they're meaningful, and that they're not arbitrary. They represent reality, that when you go and live a certain way, it leads to hell. It leads to perdition. But again, how did people rise above the road to perdition? It was through the word of truth, to the degree that he is participating in the truth. Jordan Peterson is speaking truth into people's lives, And as the New Testament says, the truth is setting them free. And they're saying, no longer am I a nihilist. No longer am I in this dark place. I've come out of it, and I've started to experience a whole new life. And I believe him when he says that this is something that means the most to him. He kind of gets skewered a little bit because he'll cry at various events. And, here's this guy speaking to man. Isn't he a crybaby? You kind of hear some of the more um, cynical people, or I don't know, just the people who are negative towards what he's doing, which oftentimes I just feel like they don't really even understand what he's doing. But I believe that's really reflects the person's heart. I think people see in Jordan Peterson that he's a clinical psychologist for a reason. He really wants to help people, and the fact that he has helped people through the Word. And again, think about what is the job even of a clinical psychologist. It's talk therapy, and through the power of talk therapy, through the power of the Word, a person is lifted up, inspired, the human spirit. Viktor Frankl, the great Jewish psychiatrist who was in a concentration camp, lived to tell about it, wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He was one who's talked about the human spirit and the power of having meaning. I know it's one of the books Jordan Peterson recommends on his recommended book list. And so obviously he's been influenced some by Viktor Frankl as well, though he doesn't mention him as much. But that same idea that to be spirit, to be made in the image of God, to be the culmination of why the universe has been come into being, as far as we know, has been revealed to us in the Bible. And I believe that. Now, I'm talking special revelation here, because I do think there are these signs that point to that while the Hebrew Bible participates in that universal revelation, and he can find in his great Bible series these universal patterns that are shared, there are those ways in which it transcends that. And one of those ways is the human beings are made not as an afterthought, but it begins to really change the way people view humankind. They're made as those made in the image of God. And then what does it say about them? It says that God made the vegetation pleasing to the eye and good for food. Good for food, something that's nourishing and enjoyable and pleasing to the eye. I mean, there's a whole appreciation of beauty right there in those opening chapters of Genesis, that these things come from God and they're meant. So God in that story too is serving the humans. It's completely flipped from the other ancient Near East stories, where unlike the gods of the other peoples and that want to be served, that have all these human characteristics of self-centeredness and the destructive tendencies that have plagued humanity. The God of the Hebrews is a God who from the beginning is showing himself as the one who is seeking to serve humanity. And then it says, and then God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful. Now again, this concept of blessing. Blessing. As you follow out the stories in the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible, there's woven in throughout the rest of that, the Torah, those first 5 books, this theme of God always trying to show humanity what he really meant for them. And so there's always this theme of trying to give certain people the land and to reiterate the blessing and to reiterate God's desire of fruitfulness. And ultimately, Israel gets chosen to be the ones to embody that before the world, God's original intention and purpose for humanity. And later on, then the Christians will say that Jesus proves himself to be the Son of that God. Because as he himself will say, I came not to be served, but to serve, Now, that sounds like the God of Genesis 1 and 2, the God who is undoing the pattern of uh, the ancient Near East. And Jesus says, the Gentiles, they lord it over people, and they seek that kind of acclamation. But that's not the way it's supposed to be among us. The greatest among you will be the servant of all. So this is where Christians are talking about special revelation, that which goes beyond the patterns, the archetypes, the instincts, the drives that are in humankind, to a revelation of that which cannot simply be found in nature. And a big reason that Christians believe that's so, and why we can't, is because they believe there's a disjunction between how this world is and how we are as human beings, our human nature, and God's true intention for us, so that the knowledge we gain from this world will always be partial, incomplete, and distorted, and that to really live into the Christian way of living will, in a sense, be otherworldly. It will have the New Testament will talk about entering into a new creation, into a new age, into a different realm, the kingdom of God, where it's not always going to feel the most natural. But again, this is another thing that Peterson brings up. He brings up the fact that you can't derive an ought from an is. And that disjuncture between the isness of life not always being the right moral thing to do points to this breach between the natural and the intended. The split in philosophical terms between essence and existence. Plato did see some of that when he saw that the forms, were perfect, and the reality in this world was not what it should totally be. And so then you get this whole anti-material or anti-body basis. The body is the prison house of the soul, and you want to be delivered from it. There was already a discernment way back in the beginning that that reality isn't what it should be. And so Christians refer to that as the fall and to original sin, one of the most hated Christian doctrines, but to me, one of the most obviously true Christian doctrines. Well, I'm starting out these videos because I want to talk more about Jordan Peterson to people who might be interested in talking about him as it relates to traditional Christianity. I'm going to be doing it through the lens of the people that have influenced me a lot. One of the people who's influenced me a lot is a guy that might surprise some people, Paul Tillich. Now, I'm a fairly traditional classical Christian. I mean, that's how I would describe myself. Back here, I'm in the church's library, and back here we have the set of Systematic Theology by Thomas Oden, a great systematic theology that goes through the church fathers and looks at what the consensus of the church taught in those early years after the apostles. And he does a great job of connecting all these beliefs to references in the church fathers. It's almost just like an index to these doctrines as they were being formed and shaped by the early church. And that consensual classic orthodoxy that he talks about is something I believe in. But and so Paul Tillich is not usually associated with that, although as is demonstrated in a book like this, his A History of Christian Thought, he was deeply steeped in historical Christian faith. He always saw himself, as in the preface to this, one of his students will say that he always saw himself by practice and by belief as a Lutheran, and that was what he thought himself to be. And indeed, yeah, here's what it says in the preface: by birth, education, religious experience, and theological reflection, he thought himself as a Lutheran. That's from the Interpretation of History. It's a quote from Tillich from 1936. And indeed, if you are steeped in any way in traditional Lutheran theology, and then you read Paul Tillich, you see Lutheranism all over it and all over what he says. But what he does is he, in a sense, reinterprets, but that's not even really a good way of saying it, but he approaches theology through the lens of these categories that Jordan Peterson uses. And there's no accident to that, because Tillich was probably one of the most educated theologians in the area of philosophy as well, not just in the history of Christian thought, but in philosophy. And he was deeply influenced by the Platonic, Neoplatonic traditions, the Neo-Scholasticism that had developed in the later 1800s, early 1900s kind of era, the thought of Martin Heidegger, Edmund Husserl, phenomenology, existentialism. He uses the phenomenological method. He's got a book, Love, Power, and Justice, I think it is, where basically he just goes through and he analyzes each of these concepts, kind of in that way of drilling down to what does it mean, and drilling down to what does it mean gets to the core of these things and puts forth an argument that these are things that we know to be true. This is what love looks like. This is what power, justice. Even his more popular book, The Courage to Be, is an analysis in a way of courage and using courage as a way of understanding being, drilling down on the true nature of courage. But he wasn't orthodox in many ways as far as his belief in things like the bodily resurrection of Jesus, which I definitely affirm. And for a variety of reasons, I could talk about it another time. Only so much you can do in one video. But I want to talk in the future about Paul Tillich, because Paul Tillich really believed that there's more than mere technical reason, as he called it. Technical reason is what the scientists do. And technical reason is important. I mean, I'm blessed right now by using this computer and this webcam. I use a smartphone. I'm excited about Tesla and the technology there, Elon Musk thinking about Mars, and I mean, this is exciting stuff. Technical reason has been a great blessing. I'm not anti-science in any way, but what Tillich would point out is there's another kind of reason. When we cut ourselves off from that, we really cut ourselves off from our humanity, he says. He calls it ontological reason. Ontology having to do with being, the nature of being, the very things that Jordan Peterson's talking about. And that just as there is a correspondence between our reason and the way the world works, so that we can study and understand it and then make decisions based on it and create things like computers and medical procedures and techniques and technology and even spacecraft, that the reason that we have within us is able to comprehend the reason and the reality, the logos structure of reality in the material world, so we can dial down onto these immaterial things, like, as Tillich did, love, power, justice, and even keep drilling down till we encounter being itself, the ultimate of all forms, God. Although, again, from a Christian perspective, God is the one who's seeking us out in this special revelation. But again, Paul said God wanted human beings to grope us, and he has included that capability in there, even in the midst of our brokenness and sin. There is this ability for those people who are really truth seekers, and there are those who are more truth seekers than others, that's to be sure, to get much nearer the truth than others. And you do see that in people like Socrates and Plato and others, that they were people more in tune with truth than others. I definitely believe that's true also in a lot of the things Jordan Peterson's saying, for sure, absolutely. But so to talk about Paul Tillich, and as someone who really, I've read his systematic theology several times through, very difficult for me to first master and understand. I don't feel like I've got it totally figured out, and I've read all of his other works as well. A really good one, talking about symbolism, is his little book, Dynamics of Faith, one I read years ago. and reread it again, and the nature of the symbol. And there's a lot to be said about symbol when it comes to Jordan Peterson. Again, not enough time to do it all in this kind of introductory video. I want to do that. C.S. Lewis gets mentioned a lot as another person. You know, at the end of his children's books, The Last Battle is the last book in the Chronicles of Narnia series. There's a quote in there at one point, or there's a statement at one point that's said by, I can't remember who says it, but the person says, "It's all in Plato. It's all in Plato." You know, I don't think everyone knows this, that C.S. Lewis's undergraduate degree was in philosophy. I think he took first in that or something. I can't remember what the award was there when he studied. But he was no slouch when it came to philosophy. And again, he was saying, you know, you go back and you see it's already all there in Plato, the knowledge of these things. And, you know, C.S. Lewis rarely quotes from any modern theologians. And The Problem of Pain, I know he quotes from Rudolf Otto, the idea of the holy and that experience of the numinous. But he also then mentions at one point this book, Symbolism and Belief, by Edwin Bevan. I'm not sure if you pronounce it Bevan or Bevan, right? Bevan. But I'd like to talk about that as well. I mean, there's so many interesting things to talk about in relation to the things Jordan Peterson's talking about. You know, again, he comes right up to the cusp of full Christian faith. And he said in a recent interview that it'd take him 3 years to really come to some conclusion about the resurrection of Jesus, what it means. And I pray that he does that, because that really is the crux of the matter in some ways. Great place to start on that. N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. I also like Michael Lacona's work on that. The great theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg talks some about that in his book, The Son of God and the Son of Man, I think it is. I can't remember exactly the title of that one. Another one who argues very strongly for the bodily resurrection of Jesus as an historical event in time and space. Others who have done that, there's a philosophical argument by Richard Swinburne. But long story short, there's, I think, a lot of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and that what C.S. Lewis came to be convinced that myth became fact in the person of Jesus. There's lots of reason to believe that this universal structure to reality is there for a reason. It was leading up to this moment of unveiling. You know, the book of Revelation is called the Revelation, not Revelations, the Revelation. And that word apocalypse, or I can't remember the Greek word exactly, apocalypsis, it has that idea of an unveiling. And it's the revelation of Jesus Christ, the unveiling. And the idea really in the Bible is that the hidden became visible in the man Jesus and in his being raised. So I look forward in the future to talking more about these things, these realities, who God is, the metaphysical truth behind the psychological truth that Jordan Peterson says. You know, the psychological truth. It's not just, he even says that he believes that there's a metaphysical reality, a beingness behind the psychological truth. And if you're really interested in a philosophically reasoned explanation of that from a Christian standpoint, I do think probably the best person out there to do that is Paul Tillich, given his knowledge of philosophy and the very same sources that Peterson's interacting with. The other thing Tillich was very big into was depth psychology, and drew heavily on that as well for his work. He's far from a very perfect person. Let me say that. If you believe the things that his wife said about him after he passed. Very flawed individual. And as far as his beliefs, like I say, I'm a much more traditional, classical, orthodox believing Christian. But I do think of him as a resource, as someone that I can draw on and find lots of great insights to because of this overlap that's there between him and Jordan Peterson, and saying there is an ontological reason that we all share in, that we all are able to, unlike what the postmoderns are saying, there is a shared universal truth out there. Yes, we might, and we are, shaped by our environments, our social location, the things that get overemphasized in a lot of that realm. You know, that's the human tendency, is reductionism. And that's Jordan Peterson's great about that too, to say ideology is only always just taking one part of the story and making it everything. And there's that idea there's a fundamental ambiguity to life. Another great theologian who thought in those terms is a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr. And I think about him when I think about Jordan Peterson talking about politics, because that was Niebuhr's area. And Niebuhr said about democracy that democracy is possible because of man's capacity for justice, and democracy is necessary because of man's capacity for injustice. Those two halves of the reality, the yin and the yang, that the two Paisleys that Peterson will point to, there in Reinhold Niebuhr's doctrine of original sin, that human beings, though good ontologically in the sense of their beingness is good, have become and are not what they could be. And they are fallen, is the Christian term for that. They are these ambiguous creatures. So that you could reduce it to one or another. You could think humans are all good, and you could think they're all bad if you just focused on one element of it, as some of the philosophers do, Rousseau and Hobbes being the ones that get mentioned for going one extreme or the other. And maintaining that balance is a big part of, I think, true Christian faith, which fits with ultimate reality. And again, I see a real wisdom there in Jordan Peterson, recognizing that and understanding it. So I'll bring this video to a close. This is really a test video to see what I'm doing, and see if whether or not there's an interest in that. And if there is, if I do get some kind of response and people want to know more and discuss more, I'd be very happy to do it. Again, I'm a generalist. I'm not an expert in any of these areas. As a pastor, I am, you know, I'm a practitioner of the pastoral office. But I do have an interest in these things as someone who wants to be a faithful steward of the ministry that's been put into his hands. So look forward to hearing from those who might want to comment or engage on Jordan Peterson and Christian faith.